Great. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to this ETI Insights webinar. My name is Halima Ahmed. I'm the Gender Advisor at ETI and I will be your moderator for today. So our webinar today is focused on addressing GBVH in commercial agriculture and fisheries supply chains. We will also be launching the Gender Action in Agriculture Principles, also known as the GAIA Principles. Apologies for all of the acronyms. Hopefully it will all become clear as we progress with our webinar today. Just to also note that this webinar is being held on the fringes of the 14th UN Forum for Business and Human Rights in Geneva. I hope some of you are there and enjoying it. And for those of you who are not there, like us, I hope it's not too cold. And our topic also coincides with the yearly 16 Days of Activism on GBVH campaign. Again, this is a very important period where we try and spotlight the issues around GBVH across the world. So for us, looking at GBVH in the world of work. Great. On to the next slide. Before we get started with our agenda, a little bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded. It is a public webinar, so we will not be using the Chatham House rules today. Things that are said may be quoted. Please use the Q&A function to ask your questions and share some reflections throughout the webinar. We will gather the questions and share that with our panelists as we get to the discussion segment a bit later on. And our agenda for today on the next slide, we intend to be here for about an hour and 15 minutes, give or take, and we do hope you'll stay with us for the full duration of the webinar. So I'll start us off with a bit of an introduction before handing over to my colleague Ella Frankel, ETI Senior Advisor, Food Farming and Fisheries, to take us through the need for the GAIA principles. I will then pass over to Heidi Chan, ETI Gender Program Lead, who will take us through the principles in a bit more detail, including an overview of how they were developed. We will then move into the substance of today, which is the panel discussion moderated by David Beck, and I'll introduce the rest of the panelists when we get there. And then I'll close us off with a couple of remarks and round us off for today. So that's our agenda for today. Before we get started, just a bit of an introduction to ETI, for those of you who may not know us, on the next slide. We are a membership organization founded in 1998, and if my maths is correct, that's a little over 27 years ago. We are the owners of the ETI Base Code, which I hope you might have heard of. This is a set of labor standards that sets out minimum conditions for workers in supply chains based on International Labour Organization conventions. We are a tripartite organization, which means our membership comprises of 3 stakeholder groups: NGOs, trade unions, and company members. And our aim is to provide practical advice, guidance, and support, particularly to company members, to address salient human rights risks in their supply chains. Our approach is very much aligned with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, as well as emerging human rights legislation. Most importantly, we are a safe convening space, which means we try and bring together these different stakeholder groups to really find collaborative solutions to complex supply chain risks. You can find out more about us on our website, ethicaltrade.org, for those of you who'd like to know more about what we do and how we do it. Right. On to our topic for today. On the next slide, I just wanted to sort of preface our discussion a bit today on gender-based violence and harassment. I think this is something that we're all familiar with. We might have all experienced in some way, shape, or form as well, because it's something that's very widespread and endemic. But in the context of the world of work, which is where we are situating our conversation today, the definition of gender-based violence and harassment really sort of became rooted and agreed when the ILO Convention 190 on violence and harassment in the world of work was adopted in 2019. And this really kind of set the level playing field in terms of what do we mean by violence and harassment at work, and what do we mean by gender-based violence and harassment. So this is violence or harassment that is based on a person's gender or sex. It includes violence or threats of violence. It can be physical, verbal, or nonverbal conduct, and it obviously it makes the victim feel uncomfortable, intimidated, offended, or humiliated. It's a range of behaviors from shouting, swearing, teasing, using sexualized language, and so on, to more serious behaviors such as sexual favors in exchange for jobs or contract renewals, for example, to really serious criminal offenses such as rape and even death in some cases. So we are talking about really serious issues here. And these are really serious issues that affect millions of workers across all supply chains, but in particular, commercial agriculture. Obviously, GBVH is a risk to workers, but it's also a risk to businesses in that they could face serious reputational harm, legal liability, and financial losses if this isn't addressed. So this is really sort of a premise of where we want to start our conversation today, with the understanding that GBVH is a very serious issue that continues to cause harm to workers in agriculture supply chains, and the need for businesses to really understand the root causes of GBVH and why we need to address it. So with that short introduction, I will now hand over to my colleague Ella to provide us with a bit more insight on the rationale behind the GAIA principles. Ella, over to you.
Thank you very much, Halima. Pleasure to see you all here today. So with that definition in mind, I just want to contextualize this in the food, farming and fisheries sector, as Halima has mentioned, and outline the background that resulted in the creation of the GAIA principles, which my colleague Heidi will briefly share with you. So as context, women constitute roughly half of the world's agricultural workforce. An FAO report considered that as high as 90% of all workers in secondary seafood activities such as processing are women. Yet, women workers in commercial food, farming and fisheries supply chains tend to occupy labour-intensive roles, often with limited opportunities for progression. They frequently work without permanent contracts, working instead in more precarious circumstances, such as seasonal, informal, part-time or temporary positions. Power dynamics and hierarchies in these food, farming and fisheries operations often manifest themselves through a vast overrepresentation of men in supervisory and management roles. By pushing women to the bottom of the employment hierarchy, the resultant power relations increase the risk of sexual coercion and harassment. This, often alongside a range of social and institutional norms and practices, contributes to an environment in which women's opportunities are restricted and their exposure to sexual abuse, discrimination and harassment heightened. Precarious work can also obstruct some workers from accessing legal protections or union representation. Labour informality, subcontracting arrangements, and long and often complex supply chains can further exacerbate these issues. An ILO study from 2018 found, and I'm going to quote here, non-standard forms of work, including temporary work and informal work, are key factors in creating power differentials for perpetrators to carry out sexual violence and harassment against women workers. All these points that I've just mentioned could be further unpacked and elaborated. We could run a whole session on those alone, but I wanted to just share them because I hope that helps to underscore the motivation for the creation of the GAIA principles that seek to address these entrenched and deeply concerning realities. Businesses along the supply chain have a responsibility to ensure the safety of all their workers, which includes job seekers, temporary or contract workers, and others. However, GBVH in global supply chains, including food, farming and fisheries, remains largely hidden, often ignored by and invisible to stakeholders engaged throughout the value chain. Ethical audits, which are used frequently as one tool, consistently fail to identify these issues and underreport their prevalence. Value chain dynamics and associated competitive pressures often result in risk being pushed along the supply chain. Understanding the implications of purchasing practices and market structures on working conditions of women and workers and the severe risks they may face as a result is crucial. We often see that buyers expect adherence by suppliers to numerous requirements and codes, but often do not accompany this with commitments that they themselves will make to enable such conditions to be met by suppliers. The very fact that codes and policies are often created by the buyer or the lead firm, often not situated in the same location or even the same country or continent as these workers or operations they affect, can result in a disconnect between these codes and the priorities, needs and rights of workers. This in turn underpins an auditing system that often fails to identify certain risks, such as GBVH. As such, alternatives to both codes and audits need to be considered. alternatives that enable workers to shape the agenda in terms of framing the problem and the solutions. In the 5 or so years preceding the launch of this initiative, ETI supported our members to respond to several allegations of severe human rights violations, often allegations of gender-based violence and harassment, through investigation, remediation, and future preventative measures collaboratively. With that experience in hand and with a collective desire to prevent further incidents occurring rather than waiting to respond when the next allegation arose, we brought together a group of tripartite members to take collective and proactive action that would promote the alternative that I just mentioned. What was clear to us from the outset, based on this and other experiences, was that to meaningfully and sustainably address the root causes of these issues, we need a systems-based or supply chain approach, one that recognizes the interconnected and collaborative way in which supply chain stakeholders need to work and makes explicit the need for supply chain shared responsibility. Too often we hear from suppliers that they're struggling to deliver against the plethora of standards, audits, codes, and projects, and so on, that they're being asked by their customers. Each customer asking for something slightly different, albeit with the same objectives, though different enough that separate actions are needed to be taken against each. This dilutes attentions and spreads resources, be that time, strategic thinking, funds, thinly, ultimately preventing targeted and ongoing investment in addressing the root causes. Not only that, but this plethora of expectations, as mentioned previously, tends to be top-down and one-directional in nature, not necessarily speaking to the realities of those that are experiencing the issues or directly responding to them. For the change we want to see, expectations need to be genuinely co-created, with workers central to that process. And they need to articulate the roles of all supply chain actors. A supply chain approach that promotes collaboration, responsibility, and accountability by all businesses at all tiers of the supply chain. That is exactly what the GAIA principles have sought to embed. And I hope that Heidi can emphasize that to you further as she speaks through what the principles are and how we got to their finalization. Over to you, Heidi.
Great. Thank you, Ella. So to enable the supply chain approach Ella just mentioned, ETI developed the Gender Action in Agriculture Initiative with its tripartite membership. These principles were developed through a meaningful stakeholder engagement approach by actively working with businesses, including buyers and suppliers, producers, growers, NGOs, and trade unions. ETI engaged with representatives from more than 90 companies and organizations. This included stakeholders on the ground in sample supply chains in Kenyan tea and flowers and South African citrus. It's important to note that these supply chains were selected as they were important to our member companies, not because they were particularly problematic. The risk of GBVH is global, as we know, and it affects most supply chains, as does GBVH affect most communities. We agreed on the need for a set of principles that could align stakeholders and allow them to effectively coordinate their actions to address the root causes of GBVH. Following 2 rounds of workshops and conversations this year, we worked closely with a smaller group of tripartite members to finalize the principles we present today. So here they are. The GAIA principles to end GBVH in commercial agriculture and fisheries are aligned with key international standards, the UNGPs, an OECD M&E guidelines, an ILO tripartite M&E declaration, and of course, ILO Convention 190, the Violence and Harassment Convention. Just click on the slide. Our contribution, therefore, is a framework for all businesses that sets out the key components of a gender-responsive human rights due diligence approach. This framework sets out principles for business when they employ workers, when they purchase services such as security or recruitment, and when they purchase products such as tea, flowers, or citrus. The principles consider the different impacts businesses have on workers' rights and the risk of GBVH in their own operations and the supply chain through their business relationships, therefore thinking about every single angle of business activity. Businesses should identify, prevent, and mitigate risks and remediate harms that affect workers on the basis of gender, while monitoring and accounting for impacts of these actions. A gender-responsive approach recognizes that gender intersects with other social characteristics, such as ethnicity or migrant status, shaping workers' experiences differently. These therefore need to be taken into consideration when actively addressing root causes that perpetuate GBVH. This is best done by determining actions with workers themselves, the experts, by ensuring workers, especially women and other workers at risk, are able to represent their needs and raise their concerns and engage with their employers constructively. Therefore, freedom of association and collective bargaining form the foundation of these principles as enabling rights that lead workers to be able to collectively raise their voices. And more will be said on this later. We also sought to emphasize two further points that make these principles specific to addressing GBVH. Accountability and prevention focused on stopping perpetrators. Would-be perpetrators should be stripped of the opportunity to abuse their positions and power through stronger, more transparent procedures, and know that they will face consequences for any GBVH. This came out incredibly strongly during our discussions and our workshops. Furthermore, every worker should know the role they have to play as active bystanders to create those safe and respectful workplaces we all want. This does not absolve business of their responsibilities, as they too need to hold themselves accountable to workers and other stakeholders who can then engage with them in a constructive manner to make further improvements. Decisions and actions should prioritize victims' and survivors' safety, needs, and wishes from first report through to remedy. This reinforces workers' agency and centers workers in the decision-making process around prevention, protection, and remedy, consistent with a meaningful stakeholder engagement approach. Finally, every business in the supply chain has a responsibility to address GBVH. This responsibility should be shared and upheld at all levels, not pushed down to lower tier partners. These principles, therefore, can act as a point of reference in discussions about taking responsibility for specific actions and requesting and receiving information and support from partners across the chain and beyond. These principles should lead to aligned and coordinated actions. And just as the principles themselves, supporting tools and resources, actions, and implementation should remain tripartite, the result of company, trade union, and NGO collaboration. Thank you. We'll now hand over to Halima.
Thank you so much, Heidi, and also thank you, Ella, for the wonderful overview and sort of scene setting, and for all the work that's gone into bringing these GAIA principles to life. We will now move into our panel discussion for today. This will be moderated by David Beck from the University of Coventry, Professor of Creative Economies and Ecological Sustainability. He will be joined by Dr. Wilson Odiyo, Corporate Affairs Director of Eastern Produce Regional Services, which is an agricultural export company with operations in countries like Kenya and Malawi, specializing in products such as macadamia nuts, coffee, and tea. We also have Caroline Downey, Executive Director of the NGO Women Working Worldwide, based in Manchester, with a mission to empower women in global supply chains to claim their rights and achieve decent wages. Last but not least, we will be joined by Mofolozi Morokong, who is the Africa Occupational Health and Safety Specialist at the IUF. This is the Global Union Federation for Workers in the Food, Agriculture, and Hospitality industries. David, over to you and to our panelists.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you very much for the introductions there, Halima. So it's my honor to be moderating this panel where we have three experts with different perspectives which are really important for understanding the genesis of these principles and how they might be implemented. So without further ado, I shall begin by asking Caroline to respond. So Caroline, you are the Executive Director of Women Working Worldwide, which advocates for the rights of women workers globally. You've worked on GBVH issues in many different supply chains, including tea and flowers. Can you please talk about the importance of worker voice and taking a survivor-centered approach when using these principles?
Thank you, David. First of all, can I just apologise for my very croaky voice? So if I give up halfway through, I might need to have a drink. So just bear with me. I'd like to start first by sharing two of the best pieces of advice I was given when I first started working in this field. One is start where people are at, and the other is put the last first. The first came from community engagement, and the second from international participatory work, and both sit at the heart of any meaningful worker voice model. And they remind us that the people who experience the issues already understand the forces that shape their lives and therefore must be part of the solution. But this only works when we pair it with a second lens, seeing the wider systems, the connections, the root causes, the cultural, economic, and gendered forces that keep women unheard, unsafe, or excluded, that allows stigma to silence survivors of rape and harassment, that turn power imbalances into an everyday reality for millions of people. So I want you to hold those two ideas, the sort of the micro and the macro. And we all know that the space between them is difficult. You've already heard from the other speakers. And I've worked in this field for over 30 years, and I'm still learning. I'm still challenging my own biases and still reaching out to understand the lived experiences of women workers and of others too, be they businesses, shareholders, male workers, whoever, and layering those perspectives with research and evidence and investigations into the root causes. And what still excites me is when all of those get woven together, and that's where the GAIA principles come in. You've already heard how they were developed, and they offer a practical framework for managing the complexities of gender-based violence and harassment. And really, they're a way for you to shape the solutions that fit your industry or your organization, your country, your supply chain, your workers. And there's nothing abstract about this. Gender-based violence is complex because behind every case sits a web of drivers. Gender norms, social constraints, colonial legacies, poverty, unequal power. And these show up in equally layered ways, whether they're microaggressions, whether they're discrimination, stigma, violence, or rape, or even death. So the actions required are layered too, from living wages to lighting pathways, from more women in leadership to male champions, from changing laws to changing shift patterns. And these impacts are felt by real people, young, old, married, single, caring for children or parents. Women are not a single homogenized group, and neither are men. And we must understand where people are at, see the world from their perspective, and engage with them meaningfully. And I will just say that choosing the right participation and engagement approach is absolutely vital. But that's a whole other session, and we can deal with that another time on another webinar. For today, let's come back to the most important element, what I describe as the beating heart of all of this, and that's survivor voice. Because survivors are telling us with absolute clarity what they need. They need safety, immediate and long term, so they're not forced to work beside the person who harmed them. They need control over how their stories are heard and shared. They need economic security because reporting abuse can mean lost shifts, relocation, legal costs, and no one should have to choose between safety and a livelihood. They need justice that doesn't re-traumatize them, that doesn't require years of waiting, like the Sex for Work survivors in Kenyan Tea, whose case has dragged on for almost 3 years. They need systems that don't make them retell their trauma again and again. They need trauma-informed support, counselling, medical care, peer support, someone who understands stigma, shame, and delayed disclosure. But they also want something else, something deeply powerful. They want to be part of the solution. Survivors want their experiences to shape that prevention, to shape those complaint systems, and to shape accountability. These are not add-ons. They're the backbone of any credible gender-based violence and harassment programme. For those who have survived gender-based violence, the asks are simple, human, and universal. Their voice, safety, understanding, support, justice, and a seat at the table where solutions are made to prevent gender-based violence. If we can honour those asks and truly honour them, then the GAIA principles won't just be a framework. They'll be a pathway to workplaces that are safer and fairer and profoundly more humane. Thank you.
And thank you, Caroline, for that very powerful contribution to this panel, which I think will have given everybody present a great deal of food for thought and reached into many hearts and minds as well. Please just to echo the comment in the chat from Halima, if you've got comments, questions, please pop them in the Q&A and then they can be, those questions or comments might be for the panelists or indeed for the ETI members who are here who've been guiding this whole process. So please do engage and make sure this is an interactive session as much as possible. Okay, we'll now move on to Mufolozi. And Mufolozi, you work closely with trade unions across the African continent. For example, the IUF have delivered training to South African trade union representatives about GBVH earlier this year. And you've also spoken to some of them about the GAIA principles. So perhaps you could explain to us why freedom of association is so important in the effort to end GBVH. Now the moment of truth. We've had a few technical problems today. Let's hope that Mufolozi is audible. Not looking or not sounding too good there. Okay, so I think we'll have to assume we still have a technical problem reaching out to Mufolozi. So we'll move on to our other speaker and hopefully we can solve these problems so that we can get the IUF perspective on these issues a little later on in the discussion. So we'll move now to Wilson. Wilson, you've been open about the challenges you've faced in the EPRS group. You occupy an interesting position as a business, supplying to retail and also a buyer within your own supply chain of growers and smallholders. Whilst the principles are deemed to be, directed at commercial agriculture, large-scale agriculture, you do, of course, have a really important perspective on all of this. So perhaps you could tell us what you think is important about these principles. Over to you, Wilson.
Thank you very much indeed, David. Well, if you had asked me 5 years ago, or slightly more than 5 years ago, about 6 years ago, whether we had problems of gender-based violence and harassment at the workplace, in our workplaces, I would probably have told you no. The reason I would have told you no is because we hardly had any reports at all. And this is not to say that we did not at any point believe that GBVH was wrong at the workplace, that it needed to be, stamped out or controlled to the extent that we possibly could. But it's just that, and we had some sort of mechanism for reporting. Little did we realize that what we had as a mechanism was not good enough. Now, so and around that time, we had challenges in our businesses. We were accused of violations of human rights, principle, of course, among them being gender-based violence and harassment. So that took us by surprise at the time, but what we did is that we overcame that and we said, why don't we look at ourselves more deeply? Why don't we look at our situation and see, could these people who are talking about our businesses possibly be right? And so that was the start of our journey through, human rights due diligence and meaningful stakeholder engagement, and just finding out through HRDD what were the risks, and with specific emphasis, of course, in GBVH. And that led us to the development of operational grievance mechanisms in our businesses, in two of our companies here in Kenya, as well as our company in Malawi, and which then, based on UNGPs and with the right mechanisms for reporting, investigation, and ultimately remediation, that done in a gender responsive manner, we began to see that it isn't that we did not have GBVH in our businesses, but what was happening is that we did not have a mechanism that people were confident in, that they felt that they could report to, that could investigate their claims. And the moment we had those in our operations, then we began to see people coming forward and reporting these cases. And so the major lesson then that we learned is that it's very important not just to have a mechanism, but you have the right mechanism that people are confident in, that people can say that I can confidently go and report whatever issues I have to this mechanism. So that was very important. And, it's very interesting also when we talk about the principles and we talk about the OGMs, that are actually in my view, you cannot, the OGMs give you a very important platform for dealing with GBVH, for implementing the principles, because then it means that you can, you have a mechanism that people are confident in, a mechanism that can deal with GBVH when it does arise. But of course, the mechanism deals with GBVH when it arises. But one of the other things that then became very important to us and is, this whole idea of how we recruit. Because recruitment, especially in terms of when we have an individual being in charge of recruitment, or when you have contracts that are renewed, or that, fresh contracts being given based on a narrow scope, so that it's one person or very few people involved. So one of the things, of course, we have done is to relook at our contracts. First, make sure that there's a committee that is involved with recruitment, and also that the contracts are given for a longer term. And of course, then came in our ETI membership. We joined ETI, and we have immensely benefited from ETI because we have been able to gain from the perspectives of the other participants, the NGOs, the other companies, the unions, and we have then further participated in the GAIA principles, speaking, of course, giving our perspectives and also learning from the other participants in the GAIA principles. So implementation then must finally, in our view, end up with socializing the principles with the various stakeholders, including our workers and the supply chains, ensuring that they know what they're signing up to, and just ensuring that there is training and awareness mechanisms put in place, so that we can get a feedback loop into what it is that we need to do and do better. So yes, that's what we are doing, and that's how we see it going forward. I think lastly, the last comment that I want to make is that this has also led us to relooking at our policies and revising them to make sure that they are that both the letter and the spirit of the policies are aligned to the principles, the GAIA principles. Thank you.
Thank you, Wilson, for those fascinating insights and for your openness, honesty, and transparency around the processes you've been through with your business. And it's makes such a difference to be able to hear, what it is like trying to run a business whilst trying to also meet these kind of guidelines, which, as you say, can come as almost like a cultural shock when you discover that these issues are going on and you'd never really realised. But it also highlights to us the importance of mechanisms that do have the sensitivity to pick up issues, because otherwise it becomes very easy for them to be brushed under the carpet and ignored. So thank you so much for those insights, and we look forward to hearing a little more from you in a moment or two. I'm not sure if Mufalozi, he popped up a minute ago on my screen, but seems to have disappeared again. Mufalozi, if you are there, please can you speak? And if you're not, we'll move on to someone else.
I think we might have lost him again, David. So perhaps we move on for now. But we do have Irem from who could possibly answer some of these questions. I don't know, Irem, if you're able to join us. Fantastic. Okay, so
Hello.
we will.
Thank you very much. I'm really sorry that we're missing Mafalosi for his inputs, but happy to step in with some remarks on the importance of freedom of association and collective bargaining in addressing this issue. I'm from ITUC, International Trade Union Confederation, which is the global voice of national trade union centers from over 170 countries worldwide. And we work on many issues concerning labor rights and equality in the world of work, and gender-based violence and harassment is a key issue, along with Convention 190, as were mentioned before. For us, of course, organizing and collective bargaining are one of the most powerful tools to democratize workplaces and tackle issues such as gender-based violence and harassment. Uniquely, trade unions give a collective voice to workers, enabling them to demand concrete measures from employers and governments, rather than having to stand up alone and risk retaliation. They create also spaces for women and other at-risk workers to discuss and address violence and harassment, including gender-based violence and harassment, which helps break the culture of silence, again, was mentioned before. Unions are also running organizing campaigns in specific sectors concerning the ones also being discussed today, where violence and harassment is more prevalent. Of course, we also see the representation of women and other underrepresented groups in the decision-making structures of unions, very important. So freedom of association and being able to join and participate in unions is a way of those workers facing more gender-based violence and harassment, or at risk of more gender-based violence and harassment, to keep this in the agenda of unions and collective bargaining discussions. And there's also evidence that shows union membership directly reduces exposure to violence and harassment. Through union membership, workers gain access to legal assistance, to information, other support services, and as I mentioned, a collective voice to challenge GBVH. Research conducted in Turkey in 2024, for example, showed that unionized workers are more than 8 times less likely to experience sexual violence than non-unionized workers. And the same study also found that facing discrimination, one of the key contributors to violence and harassment and gender-based violence and harassment, was twice as high for non-unionized workers compared to those with union membership. Another study in Honduras, for example, focusing on specific sectors in garment, textile, and auto part subsectors, showed women workers without a collective, not being covered by a collective bargaining agreement, were more than 10% more likely to face sexual harassment. So yeah, collective bargaining and freedom of association is really key to tackle these issues, and we're very pleased to see this as a high importance given in the GAIA principles as well, so that workers, rather than individually having to confront abuses and violations, they are able to collectively raise their voices, help set up preventative measures that are more grounded to their actually day-to-day experience, and so prevention can be also more effective this way. Just a few words I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those fascinating insights, and thank you for your amazing ability there to freewheel into the job and deliver so superbly around. That's absolutely brilliant, and it's also very heartening to hear about the benefits of unions and freedom of association and the very real differences that can actually be made on the ground in a world in which collective action is under so much attack from different angles. And I think today's session is part of reinvigorating the importance of such concepts for more just workplaces. Okay, we can now move on to Q&A. We've had 3 fascinating presentations covering different perspectives on these issues and the implementation of the principles. So now let's see what our audience, oh gosh, gone up to questions are flying in. So let's see how we get on in terms of getting through them. Thank you so much for the questions. So we'll start with Downey, who has asked, with agricultural supply chains that have smallholder farmers, when we see GBVH not on the farm but in the home of the farmer, how does this organisational responsibility sit? Which is a very interesting question about the off-farm responsibilities. So the panelists, I can pick on one of you, but if one of you wants to go first, then jump in.
More than happy to. More than happy to. I would say, yeah, it is a really good question, and it's something that quite a lot of companies grapple with. The idea is that your responsibility ends at the farm or the factory gate, but actually there's quite a lot of work that businesses can do, and it can be around things like education within the factory or within the farm around what are the benefits of looking at some of the programs of work around keeping women safe and how they can improve the working and the living of people outside the factory or the farm. So their ability to be able to add to the economics, so sort of financial security. So promoting the benefits of that work within the workplace actually has a ripple effect as it goes out into the community. And I think the other aspect I would look at maybe would be to look at the business model. What is it that business and the way that they are in reacting and interacting with the smallholders, does it reinforce some of the issues that people are facing for gender-based violence? So both within and also looking at that sort of linkage from a business point of view. So I'll let somebody else pop in as well.
Okay, Wilson.
Right. I think I'll just add to what Carolina said, just to practically talk about 1 or 2 things that we are doing. We are currently in the process of carrying out supply chain due diligence, specifically targeting our smallholder growers. And we've done 1 company, we are moving on to the next. And what that is revealing, of course, is that in a smallholder, talking about, workers and the farmers and their workers being able to organize, that is virtually non-existent because, of course, they are not unionized and things like this. So we think that there's a way in which we have a responsibility. And one of them is to carry out, of course, awareness, which we are doing. Now, the other thing is to open them up to our grievance mechanisms, so that, and our grievance mechanisms, not only do they receive complaints, but they are also carrying out awareness campaigns, not just within our operations, but also within the community from which our suppliers are coming. So there's the awareness element, and if anything goes wrong, then there is the reporting, the investigation that our OGMs can take care of. So those are the things that we are doing in addition, of course, to what Caroline's contributions are.
Thank you very much for both of you for those very thorough answers to what is actually one of the more difficult questions in terms of managing these issues when businesses are, basically located within communities, and how you manage that relationship on and off farm. Thank you very much. And that, no doubt, is an issue that will be raised many times, and there'll be lots of discussion as these principles move forward. Okay, Christopher is asking, what is the one change in business practice or industry behavior that would most effectively reduce GBVH in these supply chains, and why? That sounds like a whole thesis in there, but we'll see what we can do. Oh, Heidi's keen to pop in and contribute and answer this one. Heidi, over to you.
Okay, well, I'll get us started at least. And now this is a bit of a trick question, isn't it? Because often we want to see multiple actions, but I will take the bait and share that I think what we need to focus on here is accountability. So rather, the temptation would be like, let's strengthen grievance mechanisms. But actually, that is putting that onus back onto the victim or survivor to report the issue. And that's not getting at the root cause, is it? So it's about accountability. And this starts right from the top, right? Ensuring that there's a very clear commitment that business takes it seriously, that any form of GBVH is not tolerated. And that's a scale of actions. I know we often quite think about the severe cases, which obviously demand our attention. So it starts right from the top, that's setting the tone and making sure that decisions also reflect this priority. So we have this very clearly in our principles about that important role senior leadership plays right across the supply chain, right? So that just sort of cascades, that every decision is taking into consideration what's the risk of GBVH. And practically, that looks like that if behavior happens that is unacceptable, and of course, we need to take actions to make sure everyone's clear about this, taking that definition Halima gave to us, socializing that, and sort of saying, what does this look like in our workplace? How does this culturally manifest? Let's say that's clear. Then we need to be very clear with that accountability so that if someone does commit GBVH, that everyone can see that that person is being held to account for it. Obviously, following a proportionate disciplinary sort of a procedure that's already agreed and set with worker representatives at the start. But it's about accountability and taking that onus off of victims and survivors so that people see, and but this is unacceptable, and we nip this behavior in the bud. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Heidi. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more that just getting to the root principle, accountability needs to run through everything, and accountability right throughout the hierarchy, which then means that there is no single thing. It's all about a complex web and network. But if you've got accountability at the heart, then you've got a good chance of making some difference. Would any of the other panelists like to comment on this one before we move on to the next? Wilson, you had your hand up, but removed it.
Yeah, just a very brief point for me. One of the major issues that we saw, and we always saw it coming because of very high levels of unemployment. One of the big areas that of exposure was around recruitment and around contracts. So recruitment in the sense of because getting a job is almost a life and death situation. So GBVH is very, very likely to happen around employment issues. So what we've done with the recruitment is to make sure that rather than have an individual be responsible for recruiting these lower level employees, have a committee do that with representation from the workers, from the management, from the union. Obviously, the criteria is there, so just ensuring that the criteria is still met. And secondly, looking at the contracts. we know we have situations where people have used contracts, especially the very short-term contracts, to violate the people who are looking to be employed. And so what we have done, granted, we are a seasonal operation, but we've had to relook at our entire, the seasonality of our work and ensure that we offer the employees the longest possible contract so that there's a reduced likelihood that one would be able to take advantage of their, the fact that they're desperate for a job to then get involved in GBVH. So just one of the things I needed to add, that for us, that's where it starts, and that was critical for us to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Once again, fascinating to have the insights from inside a business, very practically based, which really helps us to understand, because often translating abstract principles into action is the hardest thing. So to have a panelist who can really speak to that, those kind of things is so valuable. Thank you. Caroline.
Oh, here we go. Yeah, maybe slightly controversial. And I think it's really difficult to choose one. So whoever asked that question should be taken outside. But maybe it's also education of men. Most of the perpetrators who carry out gender-based violence and harassment mainly are men. So there's been some fascinating work, in particular done in places like Iceland, where they've actually started to work with nursery school boys and girls and looking at different ways of reinforcing some of the different behaviors that are required from both men and women, boys and girls. So looking at empathy and working on things like power imbalances with the boys, and also working with the girls and looking at how that they can be more assertive in the way that they behave. So I think there is no one thing, and I think that's part of the issue that we're all dealing with. And I mean, you could go on to say, yes, there's accountability, as Heidi was saying, but there's also about that whole idea of having a safe, confidential, and consequence-free reporting line, which means that if gender-based violence and harassment is up there, that it's not hidden, then hopefully it wouldn't happen again. So no one answer. Sorry, very complex, and it's dealing with those complexities that we're all dealing with at this particular moment in time. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Okay, let's move on to the next one, which is from Sabita, and this is asking about trade unions. Because obviously trade unions are not a homogenous group. We do find them structured in different ways. And the question here is around male-dominated trade unions who don't represent the lowest paid women workers. So what should companies do to support workers in their supply chain when these kind of imbalances are to be found within the representative bodies? Caroline got her hand up even before I started speaking on that.
That's because I saw the question. No, let Ella start, because she hasn't spoken yet.
Thanks. I'll keep it brief, Caroline, so you can come in as well. I think ultimately, I think we would all agree that increasing opportunities and decision-making power for women and at-risk groups is fundamental to responding to and progressing many of these issues. And that includes both increasing the number of women in supervisory positions, but also in trade union leadership. That would go along with, an increasing knowledge of women's and other at-risk groups' rights, and inclusive workplace training, as Caroline said, with a focus on participation of men. And that training would extend to trade union representatives, women's leaders, and ensuring that it's tailored accordingly. I think my main message on this, I could talk for a long time, is that I don't think that we should take such a reality to suggest the creation of parallel structures that could undermine the functioning of organized trade union representation, but rather that we should lean into ensuring that there is the space for awareness raising, training, and promotion of women into decision-making roles within those structures to ensure that all the points that Irem mentioned around the benefits of collective bargaining, the fact that they are enforceable, that there is recourse, that we can build in some of these things into verifiable and monitorable collective bargaining agreements is really critical. And I will give an example, though I can't speak to it anywhere near as well as and as proficiently as Morphology could have done. But as part of the work on GAIA, we engaged in South Africa through the IUF with several local trade unions. I saw there was a question in the Q&A also about the context in South Africa, where we really engaged union leaders in conversations around the principles and understanding the role that unions could play locally in promoting these issues and engaging in decision-making structures and accountability mechanisms at workplace level to ensure that lots of what's contained within the GAIA principles is embedded into policy and that there are structures that are able to support that representation. So I think I would say in short, it's really about leaning into supporting, organising, training and creating a space that women can act as decision makers within the trade union structure. And the last thing I'll say, which is perhaps slightly more tangential, but goes back to what I said at the beginning, which is about the precarious nature of employment. What we see in situations where women are precariously employed is that they're less likely to organise because they only contracted on a seasonal basis, or they need to be reorganised and rejoin a union on an annual basis, which makes it much more complicated for them to engage in those structures. So I think perhaps feels indirect, but by increasing the permanent and direct employment of women on secure contracts, it creates a space for them to be better organised and rise through the ranks of the trade union representation. Part of the reason we have men in those roles often is because it tends to be that they are the ones on permanent contracts and therefore are more organised. And so I think it's really trying to understand the root causes as well of why that might be the case in situations where it is, but promoting a path to unionisation, organising and freedom of association. Caroline, please go ahead.
Oh, that was absolutely brilliant. And very much what I was going to say as well. So I think from where we're coming from, it is about recognizing, obviously, as the speaker said, about the strengths of freedom of association and collective bargaining, but it is, where are those women that are within those structures as well? And if they're not there, and as you've said, Ella, the permanent contracts and the way that they can become part of the union are absolutely crucial. And there is a very good report from ETI on the safe spaces and looking at, in particular, how women will come together in order to speak their voice, and then we'll come into the more formal social dialogue, freedom of association, and I think that's what I was trying to say in my beginning of my speech, which is about that work of voice is almost a precursor. Learning how to get your voice heard is actually a precursor to that social dialogue that happens and the freedom of association that goes on. So absolutely, yeah, we need to work on the unions as well, because the unions are not perfect. None of us are. And there are certainly some learnings that can be taken from different aspects of community engagement and community development and participation that should be working with the unions as well. So that freedom of association and collective bargaining represent all of those workers, not just the ones that are on permanent contracts. So thanks. Yeah, that's.
Thank you. Thank you both for those very thorough and thoughtful responses. Okay, moving on to the next question from Nora. I'm just going to cut into the second half of this one, which I think is a very interesting point to make. How can we ensure that grievance and reporting mechanisms are not merely formal procedures, but genuinely are accessible to women migrant workers, considering the language, status and cultural barriers they face? Which obviously this is a really key issue, as migrant workers tend to form significant parts of agricultural supply chains around the world, often very vulnerable people, and often kind of left out of formal systems. So I think this is a really critical question. So would someone like to make a comment and to address this issue of grievance and reporting mechanisms and migrant workers?
Can I just start with a really practical one, which is to ensure that a lot of the policies and procedures are actually in the languages of the people that you're talking to. A really crucial point is that many of the women that we've worked with have absolutely no idea of what those policies and what those procedures are. So if you're talking about people who've got a different language, then it's definitely something. I mean, it's a really small practical step, and I'm sure others will come in on other things, but that's for me is probably the first starting point.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Caroline. And I think it goes beyond language as well. It's understanding the cultures that people come from, because the way those words can be expressed, the straight translation's one thing, but what it actually means to people is something completely different. So sensitivity to those kind of issues is absolutely crucial. Okay, Heidi.
Sure. Great. So yeah, just to reinforce what Caroline has said, this requires proactive outreach. So if we identify barriers for any group of workers, this requires designing those procedures, with them or worker representatives, or in some cases NGOs that may have specialism in this and understand sort of how to design these to ensure they're accessible. I think as well, especially in the migrant experience, but I think overlaid on in any kind of recruitment process is important right from the start of hearing about a job, that workers understand that GBH is not acceptable, that there are mechanisms to report that. I think then practically as well too, in some cases, this is where looking at potentially community-based reporting mechanisms as part of grievance mechanisms could be a way to ensure that systems are accessible to workers. They're maybe familiar with individuals, that those systems are trusted. So it's up to companies to really interpret, how do we create that trusted grievance mechanism by engaging with workers too, who worker representatives who are able to shape and inform that. I think Ella will also have some insight, because ETI has done some work on grievance mechanisms and agricultures a lot with migrant workers too. So I'll hand over to her.
Thanks. Yeah, you did it for me, but I was going to plug some other work that ETI has undertaken earlier this year on grievance mechanisms, as Heidi says, primarily working with migrant workers in Southern Europe. And there's plenty of resources available that speak to our findings from that experience. So do take a look at those. We'll have to circulate those after as well, if of interest. I think really what it came down to was dialogue and trust. So, there can be the on paper most beautifully designed or tech-based app solution, whatever it is, of grievance mechanism. But if there isn't trust in the system, no one will use it. And so building that dialogue and rapport as a precursor to any kind of grievance mechanisms that obviously speaks to everyone's the points that have been made before around, safety and fear of raising issues and everything else is really important. The other thing that came out of the work that we did was that it's incredibly important to have workers and their representatives genuinely engaging in shaping the design of the grievance mechanisms to ensure that it is accessible to all the points that David, Caroline, and Heidi have mentioned, and that they participate in the ongoing operationalization and implementation of the grievance mechanism, so that there is more accountability built into the process, and that communication and open dialogue underpins collective efforts within workplaces and between supply chain stakeholders.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, we are running a bit short of time, unfortunately. I think we could probably carry on for quite a long period of time, judging by the amount of interest in the questions, but I have received a message saying that we need to move to a final summative question now. So apologies to those whose questions haven't been answered directly, but I hope amongst the answers we have had, many of these themes have been covered. So...
Sorry, David, could I just suggest that I'm quite happy to go through the questions and actually type out some answers for people if that's of any use whatsoever. So I'm happy to do that after.
Okay, that's very, very good of you, Caroline. That's superb. So yes, please, folks, do engage with Caroline and keep her typing fingers busy as to help her forget about her unpleasant cold. And
hang on, it wasn't just me. I was offering everybody else.
Oh no, it's just you, Caroline. You are the voice. No. To be fair, yes, everybody will chip in where they can. This is a really fascinating debate. Okay, let's move on to this final summative question. So, and this is from Rebecca. If you were looking back on the development of the GAIA principles and their implementation in 5 years' time, what will really great, setting the bar high there, Rebecca, really great look like? In particular, how do you imagine the role of retailers will have transformed on this topic over 5 years or even 10 years? Now, I think that's a really critical question and a great one to finish on. So, folks, let's see what responses we've got. What will really great look like in 5 to 10 years, and what role will retailers have played in all of this? Ella.
Thanks. That's a very good question. And I'm very curious to hear what other panelists have to say too. So I'll keep it brief. I mentioned in the remarks I made earlier around this often one-directional approach to implementation. And I think what we see is that supply chain stakeholders occupy rather entrenched positions and the kind of methods of engaging with one another in many situations. And I'm going to be like deliberately reductionist in how I say this, so I'm sure there are, shades of grey, but, essentially we have buyers asking suppliers to deliver a whole set of expectations and actions, and suppliers who are often ready to receive that because that's kind of how the entrenched power dynamics work at a supply chain level. And so what we've seen through the process is that often we have had suppliers saying to us, well, just tell me what I need to do. And what we're trying to say is that's not really something we can tell you through this process, because this process is really trying to embed dialogue and conversation and two-way accountability into the process. And therefore, that is part of a collective effort with relevant supply chain stakeholders to determine what needs to be done by who, in what sequence, independently or collaboratively. So I think for me, what good would look like would be a slight shaking of that entrenched relationship to one that isn't, one party says and the other party does, but rather that there is a joint understanding of implications of each other's actions on one another, and a genuine open sharing of challenges and therefore solutions that can address the root causes, because there is a leaning in from all parties. And that requires that retailers, to the question specifically, or brands or kind of buyers take a very proactive step to demonstrate the actions that they will be taking and reach out with tangible support, be that through capacity building, improved commercial realities of the supply chain, or specific financial investment, to demonstrate the commitment to embedding these principles in a collaborative way that embeds shared responsibility as a fundamental supply chain dynamic. So I mean, there's plenty of others, but yeah, we could do a round, and if anything else I feel hasn't been said, I'll come back to it.
Thanks, Ella. Anybody else wish to comment on the grand challenge posed by Rebecca? Wilson, what will really good look like for you in 5 years? What will make you smile in terms of
No, I think that it's a great answer from Ella. There are really not much else to add, but obviously we're just hoping that that buy-in aspect that we can have, not just within our operations but also within our supply chains, that there is buy-in, and that is not to say that where you have many people involved that things are never going to go wrong. Things are going to go wrong sometime. And when they go wrong, then the important thing is that then we have mechanisms to deal with them. But fundamentally, getting buy-in, getting less and less of GBVH, and ensuring that when things go wrong, because they will go wrong because of the sheer numbers involved, that then we have mechanisms to deal with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Wilson. Okay. Caroline, would you like to have your...
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously Ella summed it up beautifully yet again, and Wilson added to that. And I think it is about the fact that we're talking about a system change. So in 5 years' time, I would like to see little tendrils of change that are happening within that system change, that dialogue and that breaking down of those, as you say, those silos of thinking is actually in the ascendancy. And I think, as you say, that sort of the specific point about the retailers is that proactive support for things that are happening within their supply chains, and actually looking at some of the profit margins and putting that money back into the whole of the supply chain and affecting that balance that we see on products of how much goes towards the retailers and how much goes towards the people that are growing. So if I'd like to see a little bit more balance in that, and a little bit more, as I say, that collaboration, that would be fantastic. And a reduction in the amount of gender-based violence and harassment dealings that we're dealing with.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Well, I'll just add up with my own little summation, take my prerogative as the moderator. So what I'm hearing really and seeing through a lot of this is issues of power and responsibility, and I would say, and humility for everybody to be able to just reflect on what they've heard today, think about their own position within it, and being prepared to learn. And I think that's been a crucial part of this. And Wilson, I think, really opened our minds to that whole business of, being prepared to learn new things and accept that things aren't quite what you thought they were, and being prepared to make change. But power is obviously at the heart of everything within all these kind of problems within supply chains. And I think there's probably a need for some people to be more cognizant of the power they hold and the impact that has on others in the supply chain, and not to constantly push responsibility on those who do have relatively little power, particularly within the way that power is mediated through the financial transactions in supply chains and then finds its own cultural local impact. So that would be my kind of clarion call. Recognize the power and take responsibility where you can in order to make a change. And then hopefully, indeed, we can reach the Holy Grail, as Caroline says, of a lot less reporting, because there's a lot less to report, rather than because the reporting isn't capturing anything, as Wilson said earlier. Okay, I'll hand over back to the wonderful ETI team, who will take us on to the next part of this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David, Caroline, Wilson, Ella, and Heidi, and also Irem for stepping in so bravely when we couldn't find Mafalosi, for such an engaging discussion. I think we've really had the insights that we need to not just understand the gravity of the issue, but also some very practical actions that companies can take, and really emphasizing those really important key threads that we've been sort of talking about all through the development of the GAIA principles. I now have the wonderful task of rounding us up today, so I'll do that as quickly as I can, but hopefully you have gotten a real sense of what we've been trying to do in the sort of developing these principles, which is really to develop a set of principles that create a framework that should be used by all businesses and should not be passed down as down the supply chain as one of a tick box exercise where it's expected you do ABC. They are meant to stimulate discussion, alignment, action, and collaboration. And I think we've heard that point quite, mentioned quite a lot today about the importance of accountability and shared responsibility. Heidi mentioned the importance of commitment, so commitment from the very top, and this is commitment across all businesses in the supply chain, that we take this issue seriously and we want to make workplaces safe for each and every worker in the supply chain. Freedom of association, collective bargaining, and worker voice. I think these are things that we will continuously have to deal with, and we know that there are challenges around that, but there are also very, very important tools, and as Irem mentioned, they are very important for collectively organizing workers, giving workers a voice, and making sure that they are part and parcel of the solution. Wilson talked about the importance of applying gender-responsive human rights due diligence, and this is something that we at ETI have been doing quite a lot of work on with our member companies to build up that capacity. What does this look like in practice, and how can we use this approach to better identify, prevent, and end GBVH in supply chains? So if you'd like to know more about that, please do reach out to us. We'll be able to share some resources. And then, so maybe last but not least, going back to Heidi's point about accountability and making sure that we are holding perpetrators to account. I think that is definitely going to be a game changer and a shift in the way we respond to GBVH risks in supply chains, and also the way we respond to the needs of victims and survivors. So not the best summary, but hopefully you've picked up those common threads that we've really been trying to emphasize through these principles. And now for the moment of truth in terms of where you can find the principles. On the next slide, we've got the QR code for you to scan. Hopefully you should be able to get to the link. We will also paste a link in the chat for those of you that just want to go straight to it. We encourage you to please read them, engage with them, think about how you can apply them to your specific context, to your business. And please, let us know if you have some wonderful ideas about implementation. We are very open to working with stakeholders to bring these principles to life. We want them to be the framework for discussion and for collaboration and action. We've got our contact information on the next slide. Please do reach out to us if you would like to know more, if you'd like to talk about them as well. And last but not least, if you would indulge us with a quick exercise, because we do want to hear from you. We've had some really wonderful questions coming through. And for those that we were not able to answer, we will be preparing some additional resources to support the principles. We've got a sort of a frequently asked questions document that we're putting together. We can include some of those questions in there to make sure that they are responded to. But if you don't mind, if you could indulge us quickly with a very short poll that we'd like to ask you. I think my colleagues should be setting that up now. It's just 3 questions on a scale of 1 to 4, sorry, not 1 to 10, 1 to 4. How useful do you find the principles? I appreciate that you may not have had the time to look at them in detail, but from what you've heard today, how useful do you find them? And then if the second question is, what might you use them for? So again, we're interested from your various vantage points. We appreciate that we've got quite a broad audience with us today. If you've got some, immediate reflections on how you think you can use them, we'd love to hear them from you. And the third question is, if you'd like to keep updated on additional resources that we intend to put out going forward around the principles, please do share your contact information with us. We will add you to a mailing list and keep you updated of the resources that we put out in relation to the principles, etc. Right, I think that is it from us. It's just left for me to thank our wonderful panelists today for giving us their time and for sharing such wonderful insights and reflections. And special thank you to the advisory group members that were influential in helping us to shape these principles, and to the stakeholders we engaged with in country in Kenya and South Africa, and to my colleagues as well, Heidi, Ella, and Essie, for all the work that's gone through in bringing this to life. It's definitely been a long and bumpy road, but I think one that we're very proud of, and we hope will actually stimulate and galvanize the action that we want to see to prevent GBVH and to end GBVH and create safe workplaces for all. So on that note, I will thank you all and encourage you to please join us for our next ETI Insights session, which will be on the 11th of December, where we'll be exploring HRDD in the leather industry. Please do look out for where you can sign up for that. Great. Thank you so much, everyone. And we will see you at the next Insights webinar.